we are one of the countries in the world, one of the few countries in the world that actually has a system where we take taxpayer dollars and we pay lawyers to be on the front lines of safeguarding our civil rights in this country, and that's the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. It has been known as essentially the moral compass of the Justice Department, which is the enforcement of our civil rights statutes. And so it was very humbling to join, essentially some of the most brilliant lawyers in the US who are civil rights lawyers at the Civil Rights Division at Justice. When I got there as a young attorney, I joined great mentors and colleagues in the enforcement of a Supreme Court decision that was written by Ruth Ginsburg. And it was essentially the Brown versus Board of Education of the disability rights movement. It's called Olmstead versus LC. And this is essentially, Lori, what it says, which is people with disabilities have a fundamental right to live fully in the community, to be fully integrated into the mainstream of American life. And that means at work, in play, where you go to school, where you live. And we've had a long history of institutional segregation in our country. And, the discourse in this country, people understand about the civil rights movement by and large, and they understand about housing segregation and other types of segregation that involved Jim Crow era laws in the United States. The interesting thing is that people with disabilities that's a later statute in the civil rights, in the canon of civil rights movements. The ADA was enacted in 1990. Ruth Ginsburg wrote a decision that is the Brown v. Board, that separate is not equal for people with disabilities, in 1999. And the history of separate housing, separate work, and separate facilities still reverberates across the disability community. And my mandate with my colleagues at the Justice Department was to apply this very crucial and landmark Supreme Court decision to where people work. And people with disabilities across the United States, even in the 21st century, my time at the Justice Department and today, we're still working in separate facilities, earning sub-minimum wages. On the basis of their disabilities, performing rote manual work in workshops, separating screws, sorting buttons, recycling trash. There are other people, there's the vast majority of people with disabilities who don't work in that high degree of economic segregation. Still, the vast majority of disability labor force participation is in a disproportionate number of jobs with manual skills. And so my litigation and the work that I was working on at the Justice Department involved why and how state governments, federal, state, and local authorities were taking incentives with Medicaid funding and service system support for workforce development, and running those economic incentives into separate, segregated work settings. And that is essentially the way that those systems have been run for quite some time in the United States. But this is not special to the United States, that people with disabilities across the world have been separated from the labor force. And when you mentioned at the top of the introduction, nearly 2/3 of working age adults in the world with disabilities are in fact not employed. What we know, Lori, to be true is that nearly half of people that live in long-term poverty in the United States identify with disability. And there's a nearly $2 trillion hole in the global marketplace where labor and talent from the disability community should be. What this work led me to was vindicating the rights of thousands of people in various states in landmark cases to try to access meaningful, competitive, integrated employment in the mainstream of the economy and upwardly mobile jobs, saying that the people who had been channeled towards separate work, towards the artifice of work, but without any of the economic benefits, not only could compete in the mainstream economy, but deserved and were legally entitled to the services and supports they needed to thrive, the technology, the infrastructure, the caregiving that they needed to compete. And what we knew to be true then, and we know many of my colleagues know now, that demography is destiny. There is a rising group of people with disabilities in the world that have only known two realities. They were born after the ADA and came into the world with civil rights, and they were born during a technological revolution where access to technology has become prolific at a lower price point, that there are commercial solutions, and that they want to compete in the mainstream economy and competitively. What I realized, I was sitting in a deposition, and I had a moment where there was a debate. I mean, there was we were litigating the issue of whether my client was employable. And my client stepped away for a little while, and he came back. And this was a client that earned sub-minimum wages. And I said, "Where did you go?" He said, I have a car, so I drove a guy. Guy asked me for a ride, and I charged him $100. And I just came back, and he said, "Gina, that's more than I make in a month." Now, here is a person who is an entrepreneur. And yet, when I evaluated the infrastructure around that person and so many people like him, that there were tyrannically low expectations of public systems that channeled him into a job that was separated from the mainstream economy, earning sub-minimum wages, that technology, access to resources, and a suspension of disbelief would have allowed him essentially to enter the economy and do any number of jobs. And so that is where I began to evaluate as a trial attorney that what is in essence the next phase of civil rights, and what are rights without remedies? Where is the infrastructure around the solution? Lori, nearly 1 in 9 people with disabilities that have a technology need, only 1 out of 9 actually has the technology they need today. But yet there is a multi-billion person demand for those inclusive, accessible technologies, not in a vacuum, but to get people to work, to get people into the mainstream of the economy to participate. And so that my legal career really led me to a reckoning that I wasn't leaving the law behind when I'm entering life as an investor, but it's really that this is the next phase of achieving not just equality, which is afforded when you vindicate rights under a statute as profound as the ADA, but equity and economic justice. And a lot of my colleagues from the civil rights establishment understand that we've only started the conversation about how thou shalt not discriminate. The next phase is really about an alignment between where resources live in the world and whether they're attached to people who've been underrepresented and now have rights that they are exercising.